People must once more be taught to know their...
The rector of Didcot All Saints Church in Oxfordshire has an instinctive mistrust of being too close to pylons. As the chairman of the governors of a planned new primary school for 300 youngsters to be built almost directly under the power lines on a large new estate, he believes, even though he has no proof, that allowing children to spend all day beneath these lines is a mistake. He can't say why.
I just had a gut feeling that this was not the right place to put a school, and then subsequently heard of the possible connection between the electromagnetic fields and leukemia in children. I feel that this is not right, and whilst this possibility exists, it's not the right place for a school for children.
In fact, the Reverend Norman Wadsworth's instincts are serving him well and have led him into the middle of a new scientific mystery with important implications for everyone who lives by electricity. Evidence has recently begun to accumulate of small but significant increases in childhood cancer associated with living close to the strange force that surrounds electricity. Whenever electricity flows through power lines, it invariably gives rise to both electric and magnetic force fields. They're called electromagnetic fields, or EMF for short. Whereas the electric part of the field can sometimes be felt under a power line, it can make your skin or your hair tingle, the magnetic field can't be felt at all. It cannot be avoided. It penetrates roof, brick and concrete, and it's that field which is currently under suspicion. When the Reverend Wadsworth's new primary school in Didcot is built, the classrooms will be right beside the overhead power lines, while the playing fields will actually be directly underneath. Children will be continually passing in and out of the magnetic field. Now, there's always been evidence suggesting there's no danger from those fields, but the trend of much recent research has now begun to show a disturbing association between electromagnetic fields and childhood cancers. Scientists are careful to stress it's an association and not a cause. The new evidence comes from epidemiologists, the disease detectives who study the patterns of epidemics, and from laboratory scientists. The rector of All Saints Didcot doesn't know it, but the battle to keep his proposed new school away from power lines was recently fought 5,000 miles away in Houston, Texas, with surprising results.
I believe in America, the country of my birth, where loyalty and brotherhood...
This is a three-school complex in Houston. Over 3,000 young children work and play in its generously sized buildings and fields. In 1982, the local power company compulsorily purchased land and erected 6 huge pylons which ran, just like the proposed Didcot school, by the side of the classrooms. Normally there's no recourse, but this time the school fought back.
What we're talking about is 345,000 volt transmission lines through the middle of a school complex of approximately 5,000 students for 175 school days every year, for approximately 7 hours a day, from kindergarten through grade 12, a total of 13 years. We just couldn't take any chances, and we're not going to take any chances.
The school challenged the power company over the issue of biological harm to children from the magnetic fields surrounding the power lines. The case was heard at the county civil court in Houston in 1986 and lasted 8 days. Judge Ed Landry presided over the case, which has since become a legal landmark. Both sides called expert specialist witnesses to give and rebut evidence about the possible health risks from the lines. By a majority of 5-1, the school won its case. Now, there will be people who say that you reached your judgment in this court, even though the scientific evidence indicating biological hazard is not conclusive. What's your answer to that?
I would say that in this particular case, there was an overwhelming amount of evidence which showed the danger which these kinds of lines pose to human beings with regard to the threat of cancer.
The judge ordered the power company not to energize the offending power lines, and the power line company then diverted the pylons at a cost of $8 million. It was an ominous decision for utilities all over America. Meanwhile, north in Seattle, another significant development was taking place which was to add to the suspicions surrounding magnetic fields. Dr. Samuel Millam, an epidemiologist with the Department of Health, was investigating the relationship between occupation and cause of death.
I knew in my bones that there was good medical and biologic information tucked away in the death records. The strength of the death record is that everybody gets one. There's no way out of this life without that piece of paper being filed. As the file grew to about 500,000 records, the next thing we saw that was new and interesting was an association between electrical occupations and cause of death. The causes of death that seemed to be associated were the leukemias and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas.
And what occupations are we talking about here?
Well, those that would have an intuitive exposure to electricity or magnetic fields. Electricians, power linemen, substation workers, power station people. Those are 3 or 4 of them. Radio operators, TV and radio repair people.
And statistically, what were the chances or the increased chances of death from leukemia or getting leukemia?
Well, nearly doubled.
But the evidence remained circumstantial and contained unavoidable weaknesses. It was argued justifiably that without precise measurements of the extent of exposure to magnetic fields, neither the Houston legal decision nor Millam's work in Seattle were fully credible. Other similar studies contained similar weaknesses. So much of the evidence hung in limbo until the state of New York embarked on a project to build a huge power line network to import cheap electricity. It was an ambitious project, now completed, but not before the power companies paid a price. These are the pylons of the New York State power line bringing electricity all the way from Canada. Their construction 10 years ago was accompanied by considerable controversy surrounding the possible health hazards from the electromagnetic radiation from the wires. As a result, the state ordered the utilities to fork out some $5 million into an extensive investigation of those hazards. The results came out last July and astonished the serious scientific community. The investigation produced 16 studies, of which 12 reported effects of no concern. Of the remaining 4, it was the one conducted by an epidemiologist, Dr. David Savitz, which was to seriously challenge the conventional wisdom that magnetic fields were harmless.
These are the typical of the kind of lines we were studying in the Denver area, of just the regular neighborhood distribution lines that serve homes in the area, not the...
He checked homes in Denver where children had cancer, and then he checked the homes of comparable children who did not have cancer. He measured the strength of magnetic field exposures and assessed them further from the wiring configurations in the street.
My study shows that children who live in homes with higher magnetic fields related to power lines tend to have a higher risk of developing cancer than children who live in homes with lower exposure. It has been sometimes cited as showing that fields cause cancer, and of course that's what we're ultimately interested in. But for a variety of reasons, it falls somewhat short of that, although, again, it does point in that direction.
In America, most of the electric distribution lines into the homes are overhead. Depending on power demand, the magnetic fields in these lines can be similar in strength to those around big pylons. Nevertheless, even small magnetic fields can affect the body. In Britain, the lines carrying electricity into the homes are usually underground, but still emit magnetic fields.
In my opinion, it still falls short by the usual cautious scientific standards of saying that magnetic fields cause cancer. I think it falls short of that. However, studies like ours and others are not dismissible, and I think that the scientific community now appreciates that this question really does deserve to be taken seriously, and I think it is being taken seriously now.
Certainly, the New York Power Line Project final report took Savitz seriously, mainly because it was the first time a complex study like this had been conducted, a study whose design and methods were unquestionably sound, and one whose conclusions were first vetted, then endorsed by a distinguished independent panel of scientists. Their verdict was, the study adds to the credibility of the hypothesis that exposure to extremely low-frequency magnetic fields might be a cause of childhood cancer. If Savitz was right, and Denver was typical, then Dr. David Carpenter, who ran the project, calculates that 10 to 15% of all cases of childhood cancer might be explained by magnetic fields.
The observation that magnetic fields can cause cancer in cells may be as important in our understanding of the origin of cancer as the information that came from the understanding of the relationship between smoking and cancer. How something that is as low in energy as magnetic fields that we've lived with for all of these years can cause cancer may help us to understand the basic mechanisms of cancer formation.
Dr. Carpenter has been consulted about the puzzling case of little Billy Reed, 4 years old, and a victim of the cancer of the blood they call leukemia. He lives in this comfortable home on Long Island in New York, and his chances of survival are good.
Hi, how are ya? Did you have a good time? Yeah. Yeah? Did you play hide?
What's odd about Billy's home is that his bedroom nestles inside a cat's cradle of electric distribution wires all around the corner house on the street. His mother just doesn't know what to do about it.
I feel like I am taking a risk in staying here, but I really, for Billy's normal sake right now, that's the best thing I can do. And from this point on, I have to find out through anybody I can find out. I just have to keep asking the questions until I get an answer. If I don't get an answer, we're going to move. I want to make sure my house is safe for my little boy to live in.
But many scientists remain doubtful about the possible association between the magnetic fields and childhood leukemia, and they worry that the interpretation on the evidence may go too far. Professor Michelson.
When you get a body of reports, a number of reports that come up with the same conclusion, then you can say that there is a preponderance, or the number of reports suggest that the data may be, or the results may be more robust. However, one has to be very careful, because if you take 10 studies that point in the same direction, but 9 of them are poor, then really the 9 don't have any basis for judgment.
You don't trust the science?
I don't trust the way, I can see the problems in which the experiments were done and the way they were interpreted.
I like to cook my own breakfast. I usually start with...
Dr. Leonard Sagan, in a video promotion, wants to keep America calm about any possible risk from electricity. Here, he explains how we all live in an electromagnetic environment.
The exposures that result from these various appliances will vary, depending on the particular appliance and the distance that one is standing.
Nevertheless, given the pervasive nature of magnetic fields, on behalf of America's power companies, he's investing $3.5 million in urgent research to investigate a possible connection between cancer and the product they sell.
Why are you doing all this work?
We're doing it because there have been a number of studies which have suggested that there is an effect on human health from exposures to magnetic fields. Some of these studies have been positive, some are negative. They're quite inconsistent. But nevertheless, we feel that the responsible thing to do is to try to get at the bottom of this. Is there an effect or is there not?
EPRI will try to confirm or refute Millam's Seattle study by attaching meters to workers in electrical trades where there's exposure to magnetic fields.
There is cause for scientific concern. That's a different matter from cause for public concern. There's a mystery here. There are some associations that have been found in Denver and elsewhere that are curious. We want to find answers to what those associations mean. I think it's premature, on the basis of those observations, to ask people to do things differently in their lives that themselves may cause harm. Anxiety is harmful. I think it would be unfortunate if there were unnecessary concern among members of the public with respect to their health or their children's health.
92 Rock 7, WKGL FM, Middletown, New York.
Middletown by name and nature, this once farming county has now been drawn into the lush commuter belt surrounding New York City. In 20 years, the population grew twice as fast as the national average. Property went through the roof. But with more people came more power lines, and property began to plummet. Since the Savitt study, property values underneath power lines have more than halved.
We've been having difficulty just trying to unload it because of the power lines. We put ads out, we've listed it with brokers, and as soon as a party is interested in land and they find out the power line is on it, they walk away from it. So it's very difficult to say what is it worth at this moment in time.
But is the property value collapse an overreaction? What actual evidence is there that those magnetic fields have any effect on the body, let alone that they're harmful?
Okay, Don, we're going to do the reaction time task now. You're going to hear tones over the headphones. I need you to push the middle button as fast as you can when you hear the tones. You can leave your eyes open or shut during this task. Are you ready?
This experiment was done to gauge human reaction during the exposure to very small magnetic fields in a laboratory in Kansas. Surprisingly, there were significant effects: a slowing down of the heartbeat and a decrease in the ability of the brain to find and maintain concentration.
Well, at first I was surprised we found anything. Then I became concerned because over a number of the studies that we've done, we've seen effects of exposure to electromagnetic fields on two of the fundamental processes of life. I mean, you're talking about the heart activity and the brain activity. I mean, you're not talking about blackheads or toes or other things. You're talking about something very real. Now, these are effects, not risks at the moment, but they do indicate the fields are influencing the human body in such a way as to cause changes in these fundamental processes.
Furthermore, these experiments revealed that with human beings, magnetic fields just don't behave logically.
We exposed our volunteers to a lower level of field strength, and we saw the heart and brain effects. When we exposed them to a higher level of field strength, there was no effect on the heart and the brain. So it could very well be that some levels of exposure are much more detrimental than other levels of exposure.
But not necessarily higher ones.
Not necessarily higher ones. It may not be more is worse. It may be less is worse.
What he's shown is that humans in laboratories where they're exposed to electric fields experience a very slight decline in their heart rates from about 70 on the average to about 69. That clearly is a change, statistically shown, but whether that's harmful is not known.
The scientist who's trying to establish how those fields could be harmful is Australian-born Dr. Ross Adey, one of the most respected men investigating how magnetic fields might contribute towards human cancer. A professor of medicine in California, he's also the White House scientific advisor on magnetic fields.
What's the membrane potential?
Oh, it's about minus 55.
Sponsored by $500,000 from the Department of Energy and the Utilities, Dr. Adey and his staff are trying to crack the mysteries of the relationship between cell membranes and the promotion of cancer. One thesis developed by Adey and finding growing scientific support is called the whispering cell theory. At its very simplest, the theory works like this. Within the body, it's necessary for cells to communicate with each other. They do this by passing signals and by passing chemicals from one cell to another. If that crucial signaling, which Dr. Adey calls whispering, is interrupted or even destroyed, there's a strong possibility that the cells will behave in a cancerous way. In doing that, they will lose their capacity to control their own growth, and this in turn will lead eventually to the formation of a tumor.
What we have established is that electromagnetic fields can aid cancerous substances or cancer-promoting substances in producing the condition of disrupted intercellular communication.
And are you saying then that electromagnetic fields, together with something else, may both cause and promote cancer?
The electromagnetic fields, either alone or together with the cancer-promoting substances, will produce the what we call promotion phase in the behavior of the cells.
Which is a precancerous state?
Which is the beginning of the cancer state.
Proving the link might be to expose animals to doses that lead to the disease, but it would risk a phenomenal $6 million without guaranteed results. So the laboratory work remains slow but steady.
We also have evidence that electromagnetic fields may act as promoters independently of the presence of the cancer chemical. But if you put both together, then you see a much stronger action of their joint effects.
Are you then saying that there is now proof that electromagnetic fields can harm the human body?
I would say that the evidence from the laboratory studies is of a caliber in terms of the quality of experiments and the nature of the findings that it would be very difficult to ignore them and say that there is no danger. My personal position is that the evidence is categoric in terms of an indication of potential hazard.
Categoric in terms of potential hazard?
Yes.
Experiments on cells in test tubes are not the same as on the complex mechanism of the human body, but they do point the way ahead for future research, and it's the best that can be done.
What Dr. Adey and others have found is that there are changes that can be detected in cells which are exposed to relatively high levels of magnetic fields in the laboratory. But changes can't be interpreted as damage. We don't know what those changes mean, whether they're harmful or possibly beneficial. They are changes, it's true, and we're trying to understand what the meaning of those changes is.
Michael Scott, at 27, has brain cancer. What's unusual about this tragedy is the extraordinary speed at which the tumor has grown.
One day it just knocked him to his knees, and he was taken to the emergency room, and that was February 20th, and that's when they diagnosed him with a brain tumor. All of the doctors were surprised that it grew so rapidly. One doctor at the first hospital Mike went to wouldn't touch it. He said that it was too big and too dangerous for him to deal with it, and that they were real surprised that one could be that large, that it must have grown rapidly or he would have had many symptoms before then.
For 6 years, Michael Scott's home has been directly underneath a power line. The pylon is his back garden. He's played there, and he'll die there.
If us saying something about it to warn somebody else down the line would help one person or one child, then I'd be happy. I'm not out to get anybody's money or be a star for sure. Too ugly. But if we could save one kid or one family or anything, the trouble that we've had.
His sister is already suing the power company, claiming damages. Should she win, the decision will create legal history, even if it's not scientific proof. That's one reason why in America the race is on to get at the truth.
Within the next year or two, we'll start to get answers. Final answers won't come for a longer period of time. It takes a long time to conduct an epidemiological study. Within 3, 4, or 5 years, I think we'll know whether the
being spent. But it's here in Sweden that the effect of the New York power line project has been the most dramatic. The nation has always taken pollution and environmental health hazard very seriously, but the Savitz study alone has now prompted new and urgent research to find out once and for all whether electromagnetic radiation can harm humans. At the laboratory of the University of Umeå, biophysicists have been trying to reproduce an experiment pioneered in Spain, which reached the ominous conclusion that magnetic fields can cause severe abnormalities on the embryos of chickens. The eggs are dosed with magnetic fields at twice the frequency of power line fields. The growing cells in the embryo are held to be especially vulnerable at this stage. The experiment is one of 6 coordinated worldwide attempts to reach a scientific consensus.
We are seeing abnormalities in the development of the central nervous system, in the development of the heart, in the truncal nervous system, and in these various types of organs. And this would be, in some cases, it would be deadly they wouldn't be compatible with normal life. You wouldn't get normal development. In some cases, you would get a defect that you could live with, but of course, defects are not what you want. So.
Dr. Mield has also been working on a potentially significant experiment with human fetal cells obtained from pregnant amniocentesis tests. The cells are exposed to magnetic fields, and once again, what he sees is troubling.
You're talking about changes in the chromosome breaks, chromatid breaks, various types of defects on the chromosomes that would, if they would be confirmed, could lead to various types of diseases if they could be confirmed on man. I don't think you should be worried. For each individual is not to worry about this. But I think it's time for the society to be worried about it and look into this. Because the risks we are talking about are very small risk. And you really, as an individual, you are exposed to much greater risk. Smoking, for instance, or alcohol drinking, or driving, walking on the streets would be much more risky to your health than exposed to electromagnetic fields. But what you can do as an individual is you can try to avoid some unnecessary exposure.
Recent measurements on an 8-year-old girl showed intermittent or medium exposure just by walking under or beside power lines. Exposure went much higher when she sat near a film projector at school. Watching television at normal distance or using a hairdryer briefly produced medium to weak exposures. But at night in bed with an electric blanket switched on produced a heavy exposure, the more so when it was left on 9 hours. Even though there's no direct evidence that the appliances that surround us are harmful, the largest manufacturer of video display units in Sweden is producing screens with substantially reduced electromagnetic fields. In Sweden, pregnant women have the right not to work on VDUs. The bad news is that they cost a third more to make. The good news is the customers don't care. It's grabbed 80% of the market. But Sweden's biggest research contribution will be an unprecedented comprehensive study of homes under every mile of the national grid to find out whether living or working near power lines has produced increased rates of cancer. In Britain, as in this large new estate in Didcot, Oxfordshire, houses and schools are still being built directly under power lines. Unlike Sweden's investment, Britain's research effort into the possible hazards from the magnetic fields this year is £500,000. The power lines belong to the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board, who until last week resisted claims that there might be a link between the fields and cancer. This view was based on a number of studies, mostly sponsored by the CGB itself, which have not revealed evidence of a harmful association. The board has also relied on similar foreign studies, but the Savitz report has brought a change.
Recent epidemiological work has suggested that there is an association between wiring configuration and some health hazards, and I think we must take this seriously. I'm yet to be convinced that there is a serious causal effect.
Last Thursday, the CEGB announced a new research programme including the use of this van to measure magnetic fields both from underground lines in the street and in homes. They've also bought 30 individual meters which will be worn by their own staff to record individual exposures to magnetic fields for 24 hours a day.
I think if we're going to be really scientific about this, it's important to, particularly experiments and observations which strike at the very basic understanding of cellular processes. I think those things should be replicated by independent investigators. And I'm not alone in concluding that there's probably not a lot to worry about at the present time. having taken into account all the experiments that have been done, all the epidemiological work that's been done, including Ross Adie's work and others. And I mean, I can quote, for example, from a report from the Ontario Ministry of Health, which was published last year, who said there is little or no evidence that there is a public health risk. Or, closer to home, the Department of Health and Social Security's report by the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council said the evidence available indicates that chronic low-level exposure to the non-ionizing radiations appears to be generally harmless.
The two reports recommended as examples of no-harm studies are firstly this review, published after Dr. Savitz's Denver study by the Ontario Ministry of Health. It does indeed conclude there's no evidence of health risk, but the document has never been put to independent review. Dr. David Carpenter, who ran the New York Powerline project, finds it superficial and flawed and wholly inappropriate as a document for guidance. Dr. Cox's reply to this, I do not share those views. The second report recommended by Dr. Cox also concludes there's insufficient evidence of harm from magnetic fields, but it was written before the authors had seen the Savitz study. They've already decided, in the light of the significance of Dr. Savitz's findings, to review the whole subject again. The Ontario report was evidence offered by the CGB to reassure the Oxfordshire local authorities involved in the new Didcot estate that living under power lines might be harmful. That was their official view as late as January this year.
They are the acknowledged experts in this country, and they are the only experts that I have available to consult. They advised us at that time that there was no risk whatsoever in respect of development either close to or underneath the power lines. Since then, we have been in constant communication with them, and I've had a series of letters by way of response indicating that there has been no change in their stance on this matter.
The CGB has had a lengthy correspondence with different local authorities. The last letter sent by them in January this year again said there was no evidence of harm. A copy of this letter went to Planning Officer Michael Butt.
Have they ever mentioned to you the work of a Dr. Savitz, an epidemiologist?
No.
Of Dr. Ross Adie in California?
No.
Of Dr. Samuel Millam, epidemiologist in the state of Washington?
No.
Have they ever mentioned any of the biological work going on in Sweden and other parts of the United States?
No.
Dr. Cox replies, it would not be appropriate to give all the studies to local authorities. They ask me for advice and I give it, taking into account all the evidence that there's no significant risk from magnetic fields.
I do not think that the evidence at the present time justifies the public alarm and worry and distress which would be caused if we adopted a radical or drastic change in our policy on this matter.
Nobody's talking about alarm, Dr. Cox, but they are talking about concern. Do you exhibit concern? Do you feel concern about this?
Of course, as a doctor, I must be concerned. As a physician, I would be failing in my duty if I didn't exhibit concern. I am concerned, but I'm also concerned that we should get at the truth of the matter and that we shouldn't alarm the public prematurely by disclosing worries which may, in the end, prove fruitless.
Dr. Michel Coleman is a top epidemiologist with the World Health Organization. He's reviewed all the literature on the subject of magnetic fields and cancer. Does he accept the CGB's view that there's insufficient evidence to worry about?
Their research doesn't show that there is no hazard from electromagnetic fields. What it shows is that there is no proven hazard from electromagnetic fields. That's a very different thing. They would accept the argument that it isn't possible to show that something is totally safe. All we can do is to put bounds of confidence as to how safe or how unsafe electromagnetic fields are. And at the moment, unfortunately, those bounds are rather too wide. And we're hoping that those bounds can be narrowed by more effective and better coordinated research into electromagnetic fields over the next few years.
One new study the CGB is commissioning will be to investigate children in Britain who have leukemia. Work has already started in the town of Failsworth near Oldham, where an unusually large cluster of 14 leukemia cases has come to light, while statistically there should only be one. At this small charity do, most of the victims, their relatives and friends, have got together to try to raise money to send one young girl on a special treat. During a break in the painful therapy, Michelle will be going to Disneyland in Florida if today's event raises enough money. The estate on which all the victims live is a lowery mixture of homes and factories where overhead power lines stride through residential and industrial areas alike. Leukemia clusters are not unusual, but the one in Failsworth does seem to have a geographical relationship to those lines. That's why the Oldham Health Authority has now decided to include the power line factor in its investigation of the large cluster.
The main body of the cluster was under the power line. That could very well have been by chance. What I found particularly interesting was that 3 outlying cases that were not in the main body of the cluster, of those 2 were close to the power line. So the power line, as it were, would have drawn those 2 if that were postulated to have influenced the distribution. So the power line is certainly a plausible explanation for the distribution. Although we have to bear in mind the power line has been there for a long time during which there has been no significant excess of leukemia in Failsworth. So clearly the power line can't be the whole of the story in any way.
The involvement of magnetic fields in the cluster remains unproven. The evidence is circumstantial, but it could possibly fit this theory.
The development of cancer is usually thought of as involving several abnormal steps, several problems with a cell which eventually gives rise to the cancer. The first step we call initiation, and there is no evidence that electromagnetic fields are capable of accomplishing that step, of disturbing a cell to that extent. There is, however, some evidence that electromagnetic fields may give rise to the subsequent development of cancer by enhancing the growth of a cell that has already been disturbed in the way that I suggested. Let's say with a chemical that causes cancer. A cell deranged by such a chemical is then prone to develop into a cancer if it grows abnormally. And it's possible that electromagnetic fields may assist such a disturbed cell to grow abnormally.
Within our lifetime, these mysteries will be solved. At worst, we will have to think again about how to live in our pervasive electric environment. At best, more light will be thrown upon the once impenetrable world of cancer.
We don't know how magnetic fields can influence cells and cause cancer. We don't understand how magnetic fields interact with the nervous system, especially in things such as learning and memory. But these are challenges for the future, and what clearly is needed now is much more research on how magnetic fields exert these effects.
People who watch this program tonight and see the evidence of association between harmful effects of electromagnetic radiation may be asking, what are we going to do? We live underneath power lines, should we stay, should we move, or what? What's your advice to them?
I think we both have a responsibility to them, and I particularly perhaps, to say that there is not enough evidence at the moment to cause any alarm, and that they should continue and not to worry about it.
Only since the invention of electricity has man been exposed to these much higher strength electric and magnetic fields. And it's possible, therefore, only possible, that our physiology may not be well adapted to exposure to such magnetic fields.
The reporter in tonight's programme, Tom Mangold, will be a guest of Open Air on BBC1 tomorrow morning. He'll be talking about the programme together with Dr. Michael Coleman of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. If you've a comment or a question arising from tonight's Panorama, you can call in now on 061 815